Rome, 215 AD. Emperor Caracalla faced an impossible choice. His soldiers demanded higher pay, they were the backbone of imperial power, and discontent in the legions meant death. Tax revenues were stagnant, pushing harder risked rebellion in the provinces. Cutting spending wasn't an option, the empire's borders were under constant pressure. He had one tool left, the imperial mint. By reducing the silver content in coins while maintaining their face value, he could effectively create more money from the same resources. Pay the soldiers, avoid a tax revolt, keep the empire functioning. It wasn't theft, he reasoned. It was a necessity, a temporary measure to get through a crisis. The crisis never ended, and the temporary measure became permanent. Debasement is typically understood as a policy, a technical decision about currency composition. This framing obscures what's actually happening. Human beings, under immense pressure, making choices that prioritize immediate survival over long-term stability. The pattern repeats across civilizations not because people are foolish, but because the incentives and constraints they face push consistently toward the same solution. To understand why requires stepping into the mental landscape of those who made these choices. The Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD was a world of extraordinary complexity and fragility. At its territorial height, it stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, encompassing perhaps 60 million people speaking dozens of languages, practicing varied customs, unified primarily through military force and administrative infrastructure. Maintaining this structure was expensive. The legions required constant funding, not just pay, but equipment, supplies, fortifications. The administrative apparatus demanded resources, governors, tax collectors, road maintenance, postal systems. The capital itself, Rome, needed grain shipments to feed a population that produced little and consumed much. Imperial ambitions, building projects, public games, gifts to secure loyalty added to the cost. Revenue came primarily from taxation, agricultural taxes on provincial land, customs duties on trade, tribute from conquered territories. This system worked, but barely. It required careful administration, consistent agricultural output, political stability, and most importantly, the consent, however reluctant, of the taxed populations. Emperors understood taxation's political danger. Raising taxes openly invited resistance, sometimes rebellion. Provincial elites, who bore much of the burden and were responsible for collection, could become focal points for opposition. The memory of past uprisings, Boudicca's revolt in Britain, the Jewish wars, reminded rulers that pushed too hard, populations fought back. This created a structural bind. Expenses were relatively fixed and tended to increase. Soldiers expected regular raises. Borders required more defense as external pressures mounted. Inflation gradually eroded purchasing power. But revenue was politically constrained. Squeezing more from existing taxpayers risked instability. Conquering new territories to expand the tax base became harder as Rome reached geographical and logistical limits. The emperors who navigated this bind most successfully were those who found ways to fund the state without visibly raising taxes. Debasement offered exactly this. The logic was straightforward. If a coin's value came from its silver content, reducing that content while maintaining the face value effectively multiplied the money supply. A pound of silver that once made 10 coins could now make 15 or 20. The government's purchasing power increased without raising a single tax. The beauty of this approach from a ruler's perspective was its invisibility. There was no decree announcing taxes are now higher. The coins looked similar. They bore the emperor's image and the official stamp. Citizens had to accept them by law. The extraction happened silently through the gradual erosion of the currency's real value. This wasn't cynical scheming, at least not initially. It was pragmatic problem-solving under constraints. Emperors needed resources. Direct taxation was dangerous. Borrowing options were limited. Spending cuts threatened military and political stability. Debasement was the least bad option among bad options. The problem was that the least bad option in the short term created worse problems in the long term, and those problems, once started, were extraordinarily difficult to reverse. The pattern of Roman debasement unfolded through the decisions of specific individuals facing specific pressures, each building on the choices of predecessors. The denarius, Rome's primary silver coin, was introduced with high purity, around 95% silver during the Republic. This standard held relatively stable for centuries, becoming a foundation of commercial trust. A denarius was worth a denarius because it contained a predictable amount of silver, backed by Roman authority. The first significant reduction came under Emperor Nero, 5468 AD. Facing fiscal pressures from his ambitious building programs and the aftermath of a fire that devastated Rome, Nero reduced the denarius to approximately 90% silver. It was a modest change, barely noticeable to most users. The coins still looked and felt like silver. Commerce continued without disruption. The precedent, however, was established. When the next emperor faced fiscal pressure, the option was available. Marcus Aurelius, 160–180 AD, often remembered as a philosopher king, reduced silver content further to around 75%. His wars on the northern frontier defending Rome against Germanic tribes were expensive and prolonged. He needed funds. He used debasement. The choice was justified as necessary for imperial defense. His son Commodus, 180–192 AD, reduced it to approximately 70%. His motivations were less noble, lavish spending on games and personal indulgence, but the mechanism was the same. The fiscal pressure existed, debasement relieved it. Septimius Severus, 193–11 AD, brought it down to roughly 50%. His deathbed advice to his sons was reportedly, "Enrich the soldiers and scorn all others." He understood clearly where power resided. The legions needed to be kept. Debasement provided the means. By the time of Caracalla, 211–17 AD, the denarius was barely half silver. Caracalla went further, attempting to solve the problem of debased currency by introducing a new coin, the Gallienus, supposedly worth 2 denarii but containing only about 1/5 times the silver. It was debasement disguised as monetary reform. Each decision made sense from the perspective of the individual emperor. Each faced genuine constraints. Military threats were real. Soldiers genuinely needed to be paid. Tax resistance was genuinely dangerous. The alternative, allowing the military to collapse or the empire to fragment, seemed worse than marginally reducing coin purity. The misjudgment was in underestimating the cumulative effect. No single emperor intended to destroy the currency. Each probably thought their reduction was modest, temporary, manageable. After all, the denarius had survived previous reductions. Commerce hadn't collapsed. Inflation had been gradual. Why would this time be different? But erosion is cumulative. By the 260s AD, under emperors like Gallienus, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. It was effectively a bronze coin with a silver wash. The pretense of value could no longer be maintained. The consequences unfolded as quiet inflation. Prices rose, not dramatically at first, but persistently. A loaf of bread that cost 1 denarius in 200 AD cost 3 denarii by 250 AD, 5 by 270 AD. Wages lagged behind. Contracts written in nominal terms became worthless as the real value of currency declined. Merchants adapted by raising prices, hoarding good coins, demanding payment in kind rather than currency. This was rational self-protection, but it fragmented the economy. The denarius, once a universal medium of exchange across the empire, became unreliable. Citizens who saved in currency watched their wealth evaporate. Those on fixed incomes, pensioners, widows, soldiers receiving delayed pay, suffered disproportionately. Debasement operated as a regressive tax, hitting hardest those least able to protect themselves through diversification into real assets. The state, ironically, found its position worsening. The initial benefit, more coins from the same silver, was temporary. As prices adjusted, the purchasing power of the new coins declined. The government needed to mint even more, further accelerating debasement. It became a self-reinforcing spiral. Emperors attempted various responses. Price controls, most famously Diocletian's edict on maximum prices in 301 AD, tried to legally fix the value of debased currency. It failed. Markets simply moved underground, or goods disappeared from official markets. Legal compulsion couldn't restore trust. Currency reform was attempted periodically. Diocletian introduced new coins with higher metallic content. Constantine eventually created the gold solidus, which succeeded by being genuinely valuable. But these reforms required accepting reality. Debased currency had to be replaced, not simply renamed. The path from 95% silver to 5% silver took roughly 150 years. No individual decision was catastrophic. Each reduction was small enough to seem manageable, but the aggregate effect was systemic breakdown. The crucial insight is that this wasn't inevitable in the sense of being forced by external circumstances. It was the product of repeated human choices, each understandable in context, each prioritizing immediate political survival over long-term monetary stability. The emperors weren't irrational. They were responding to real incentives. but they operated with incomplete information and limited foresight. They saw the immediate benefit, more money to spend now, and discounted the distant cost, currency collapse later. They assumed their successors would deal with future problems, or that economic growth would eventually outpace the degradation. This temporal asymmetry, immediate benefit, distant cost, is central to understanding why the pattern repeated. Each emperor inherited a slightly debased currency and faced urgent expenses. The easiest solution was marginal further debasement. The full consequence of that choice wouldn't manifest during their reign. The incentive structure systematically encouraged decisions that made problems worse. The Roman experience reveals patterns that transcend the specific historical context, patterns rooted in consistent aspects of human decision-making under pressure. The first is the preference for immediate relief over long-term stability. This isn't unique to rulers or to currency. It's a fundamental feature of human cognition. Present problems feel urgent and concrete. Future problems feel abstract and uncertain. When faced with a choice between addressing an immediate crisis and avoiding a potential future one, the immediate crisis almost always wins. In Rome's case, the immediate crisis was always tangible. Unpaid soldiers threatening mutiny, tax revolts brewing in provinces, barbarian armies on the border. The future crisis, currency collapse, was gradual and uncertain. Maybe it wouldn't happen, maybe something else would change. Maybe the next emperor would fix it. The uncertainty made it easy to discount. Behavioral economics formalizes this as temporal discounting, the tendency to value immediate rewards more highly than distant ones, even when the distant ones are objectively larger. Emperors discounted the future cost of debasement because it was distant and uncertain, while the immediate benefit was concrete and certain. A second pattern involves the invisibility of systemic effects. Each incremental debasement seemed small. Reducing silver content from 75% to 70% doesn't feel like a fundamental change. The coins still look similar. Commerce continues. Most people don't notice immediately. But the effect is cumulative. Each small reduction adds to the previous ones. Over decades, the aggregate change becomes transformative. The currency's function shifts from a reliable medium of exchange to an unstable instrument that people try to avoid. The cognitive error is treating each decision in isolation rather than as part of a sequence. Emperors saw their own modest debasement, not the century-long trajectory. They missed the systemic pattern because they were embedded within it. A third pattern is the ratchet effect. Once debasement begins, it's extremely difficult to reverse. Stopping requires either accepting reduced government capacity, paying soldiers less, defending fewer borders, or finding alternative revenue sources, which means raising taxes or cutting other spending. Both alternatives are politically dangerous. It's easier to continue the existing practice, even knowing it's unsustainable, than to bear the immediate cost of reform. Future emperors inherit not just a debased currency, but also a political structure dependent on that debasement. Reversal requires political will and capacity that rarely exist. This creates path dependence. Early choices constrain later options. The initial debasement makes future debasement more likely, not less. The system locks into a degrading trajectory. A fourth pattern involves the distribution of costs and benefits. The benefits of debasement, increased government spending, are concentrated and immediate. The costs, inflation, currency instability, are diffuse and delayed. The government gains purchasing power now. Citizens lose purchasing power gradually over time. This distribution makes debasement politically attractive. The beneficiaries, soldiers receiving pay raises, emperors funding projects, experience gains immediately and attribute them to current leadership. The victims, savers watching wealth erode, merchants dealing with unstable prices, experience losses gradually and may not connect them to specific policies. A fifth pattern is the role of institutional memory and constraint. Early in the debasement cycle, when reductions were small and consequences mild, norms and expectations still constrained behavior. Emperors felt pressure to maintain currency standards. By later stages, those norms had eroded. Debasement became normal. Expectations adjusted. What once seemed unthinkable, a coin with 5% silver, became standard practice. These patterns, temporal discounting, invisibility of systemic effects, ratchet dynamics, asymmetric costs and benefits, erosion of norms, combine to create a powerful pull toward debasement once fiscal pressure exists and institutional constraints weaken. The pattern Rome exemplified reappears across diverse historical contexts, suggesting something consistent about human responses to fiscal pressure. Medieval European monarchs faced similar constraints. They needed revenue for wars but lacked strong taxation systems. They repeatedly debased their coinage, reducing silver or gold content to mint more coins. The English penny, for example, was periodically reduced in weight and purity across the Middle Ages. Each reduction followed the familiar logic: immediate fiscal relief at the cost of future currency instability. The Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries, despite access to massive New World silver flows, still debased its currency to fund continuous warfare. Philip II defaulted on debts multiple times and authorized reductions in coin quality. The pattern held even with unprecedented resource access. Spending grew faster than revenue, and debasement filled the gap. The Ottoman Empire engaged in repeated currency debasements from the 16th century onward, driven by military expenses and administrative costs. The axe, once a stable silver coin, was progressively reduced until it lost most of its value. The social and economic disruptions contributed to institutional decline. In each case, the motivations were comprehensible: military necessity, fiscal crisis, political survival. In each case, the decision-makers likely believed they were choosing the least harmful option available. And in each case, the cumulative effect was currency degradation and economic disruption. Even modern fiat currency systems, though different in mechanism, show echoes of the same pattern. When governments face fiscal pressure, wars, recessions, political demands for spending, they often resort to monetary expansion rather than explicit taxation. The tool changes from metallic debasement to monetary policy, but the underlying dynamic, extracting resources through currency manipulation rather than visible taxation, remains recognizable. The lesson isn't that all currency systems inevitably collapse. Many don't. The lesson is that the pressure toward short-term fiscal relief through monetary manipulation is persistent across contexts. When institutional constraints are weak, when fiscal alternatives are politically costly, and when the consequences are delayed, the pattern reliably emerges. Understanding this requires seeing past the technical details of currency mechanics to the human decision-making underneath: the pressures, the incentives, the cognitive limitations that push repeatedly toward the same choice. The question implicit at the beginning, why do societies repeatedly choose debasement despite its known consequences, has an answer that lies in human nature under pressure. It's not that leaders are uniquely short-sighted or foolish. It's that the decision environment systematically favors immediate relief over long-term stability. The benefits are tangible now. The costs are abstract and later. The alternatives are politically dangerous. The pattern perpetuates because each generation of decision-makers faces the same constraints and responds with the same logic. Roman emperors weren't villains. They were humans in impossible positions, making choices that made sense given what they could see and what they faced. That those choices aggregated into catastrophic currency collapse doesn't erase their internal rationality. It reveals the gap between individual rationality and systemic outcomes. The overlooked element in debasement isn't the policy mechanics. It's the human choices, made under pressure with incomplete information, prioritizing survival over abstract future stability. Choices made in haste reveal deeper patterns, not just about currency, but about how humans navigate the tension between immediate necessity and deferred consequence. Understanding these patterns doesn't provide easy solutions, but it does illuminate why certain outcomes repeat across wildly different contexts. The architecture of the choice, the incentives, the constraints, the cognitive biases, shapes the outcome more powerfully than individual virtue or knowledge. If this shifts how currency policy appears, not as technical abstraction but as human decision-making under pressure, there are other questions worth exploring. How do modern institutions attempt to constrain these incentives? What role does transparency play? The history illuminates more than the specific events suggest. Thank you for your attention. These patterns matter, and understanding them requires patience.